Welcome to the Joseph Smith Polygamy, the Fanny Alger affair. A little note about pronunciation. Per the family, it's pronounced Fanny Alger. All right, the Nauvoo expositor, one of the writers was William Law, who used to be in the First Presidency, which came out in one edition only and then was destroyed by the prophet Joseph Smith. June 7, 1844, the one and only edition. William Law said the grand jury found two bills against Joseph Smith, one for perjury and another for fornication and adultery. Okay, a little statement here by Gerald of Wales, pictured above on the left. This goes all the way back to 1146. The parish priest kept a hearth girl in his house who kindled his fire but extinguished his virtue. All right, a statement by William E. McClellin in a letter to John L. Trauber, December 6, 1875. And McClellin says that he visited with Miss Emma Smith in Nauvoo, that's Joseph Smith's wife, in 1847, and she's pictured above, I guess with one of her children. She told me plainly and frankly that her husband did receive and deliver the polygamic revelation himself, and she knew that he practiced its provisions. And here's the key part. Emma said that she knew that Joseph Smith had committed adultery with girls previous to that, so previous to the 1847, I guess. And of course, Joseph Smith, the prophet, received a revelation in 1831 about adultery, and it is simply that thou shalt not commit adultery. This according to Mormon scripture. And according to the Bible in Leviticus chapter 20, it says, the man who committeth adultery shall surely be put to death. So adultery is a serious sin for any Christians or for any Mormons. All right, and Joseph Smith acting like a dictator. This is a statement in Donna Hill's book, Joseph Smith, the First Mormon. Joseph announced to a congregation in the temple that since he was empowered to establish the kingdom of God, church members had no right to question what he did. The ultimate theocratic dictator. A statement by Richard Bushman, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. There is evidence that Joseph Smith was a polygamist by 1835. Now, you have to be careful with this statement. There was evidence that he was a polygamist. In other words, he took plural wives. Now, the critics have a different interpretation of this. They say that Joseph Smith in the early days, I guess 1835 or earlier, was not a polygamist but an adulterer. In other words, he did not marry the first few wives that people like Richard L. Bushman said that he married. Anyway, but Bushman asks the very important question, which we'll go over in this video quite a bit. Was Joseph Smith also an adulterer? Had Joseph Smith been involved in an illicit affair, or was it a polygamic revelation? Well, you know which one the church is going to want to emphasize. And Bushman again asking another question. Was Joseph Smith a blackguard, in other words, dishonorable, covering his lusts with a religious pretensions, or was he a prophet doggedly adhering to instructions from heaven? All right, Anne Eliza describes Joseph Smith keeping young women in his home with whom he had affairs. Anne Eliza Webb Young, pictured above, one of the wives of Brigham Young. She left Brigham Young and wrote an expose entitled Wife Number 19 in 1875, a very good book. And in there, she says that Joseph Smith had women in his home with whom he had affairs. And Anne Eliza continues, at one time he, Joseph Smith, had 11 young ladies living in his family as adopted daughters, 11 of them living in his family, to whom he had been sealed, in other words, married, without the knowledge of his wife. 11 young ladies. I'm not sure how many she was sealed to whom he had been sealed, it says, without the knowledge of his wife. So why did he do all this in secret and really crush the heart of his good wife, Emma? Why, if God was going to introduce polygamy to the church, why would he do it in secret and cause so much trouble and so much apostasy in the church? And Eliza continues, several young girls left the church in consequence of the dishonorable proposals which the prophet Joseph Smith made to them. Dishonorable proposals which caused a lot of people to leave, including some pretty high-ranking leaders of the church, and we'll get to that. This is a picture here of Robert Redford and Demi Moore in the movie Indecent Proposal. All right, Fanny Alger was possibly the first plural wife of Joseph Smith. Possibly the first plural wife, and that is really the battle here between the Mormon apologists and more of the Mormon writers and the critics. Was Joseph Smith married to Fanny Alger? That's going to be a big question in this video. Wikipedia just says possibly. Mormons like to say, oh yeah, he was definitely, or Fanny Alger was definitely the first plural wife of Joseph Smith. And here we have an interesting picture. Emma looking mad. Fanny Alger laying in the background there, kind of in the barn. And Joseph Smith looking like he got caught. All right, so who was the first plural wife of Joseph Smith? Well, it's kind of confusing because we have conflicting accounts. This is from Linda King Newell and Valine Tippett Avery, Mormon Enigma book. Very good book. Came out in 1984. They're talking about Mary Elizabeth Rollins, who claimed that Joseph had a private conversation with her in April of 1831. She was then 12 years old, and I believe she's pictured above there, Mary Elizabeth Rollins. She said that Joseph said that I, Mary, was the first woman that God commanded him to take as a plural wife. So according to this conversation between Joseph Smith and Mary Elizabeth Rollins, Mary was the first plural wife. Now, according to the Mormons and their new essays, Fanny Alger was the first wife. So we have conflicting accounts. All right, back to Wikipedia. Fanny Alger article. Scholars have disagreed about whether Smith's relationship with Alger was an early plural marriage or simply a sexual indiscretion. That is one of the main questions for this video. Pictured above, we have Brian Hales and his wife at a fair Mormon conference. Brian Hales, with the help of Don Bradley, has really gathered a lot of good sources for Fanny Alger and for plural marriage in general. But the conclusions that he makes in his 3-volume work on polygamy are pretty ridiculous. I've read a few articles from Brian Hales, and his conclusions are so ridiculous that I cannot go to that 3-volume set and read it. Okay, the evidence strongly supports the conclusion that Joseph Smith had made no claim to a plural marriage with Fanny Alger at the time of the relationship. Joseph Smith had made no claim that it was a plural marriage. That's true. Robert M. Bowman Jr., a Christian theologian who has an interest in Mormonism, put up this article on IRR.org. All right, some biographical details about Fanny Alger. Fanny was born in Rehoboth, Bristol County, Massachusetts on September 20, 1816, the fourth of 11 children. Fanny's father, Samuel Alger, pictured above, was a carpenter who had built a house for the father of future Mormon leader Heber C. Kimball. Okay, Clarissa Hancock was Fanny's mother. She was a sister of the Mormon stalwart Levi W. Hancock, who is pictured above. The Algers first moved to Ashtabula, Ohio, and then to Mayfield, Cuyahoga County, Ohio, which was 10 miles southwest of the Mormon settlement at Kirtland. So you can see the map there, Cuyahoga County, 10 miles southwest of Kirtland. So this relationship with Joseph Smith was supposed to have occurred in Kirtland when Fanny was a teenager. Okay, according to Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness, in 1830, Samuel and apparently Clarissa were baptized into Mormonism and thus became some of its earliest converts. Samuel was baptized by Parley P. Pratt, and Fanny was 14 years old at this time. In the early 1830s, Joseph Smith's Kirtland neighbors talked about his relationship with Fanny Alger. This according to George D. Smith in Nauvoo Polygamy book. A lot of rumors, a lot of gossip going around. All right, from the same book, George D. Smith, Nauvoo Polygamy. Emma Smith hired Fanny Alger to help around the house. Before long, talk about Joseph echoed Fanny's name. Maybe as early as 1832, but certainly from 1833 to 1835. We're not exactly sure on the dates. But at some point, a lot of gossip and rumors were going around about Fanny and Joseph Smith committing some kind of sexual indiscretion. The picture above, it looks like we have Emma looking into the barn. WTF! Exclamation. I am a maid with benefits. You've got a nice Fanny, huh, Fanny? Emma catches Joe and the 16-year-old Fanny in the barn together. Okay, the same book here. The ensuing scandal contributed to the dissent and excommunication that swept the church in 1837 to 1838, even after Fanny had left town and married someone else. So these rumors really swept through the community and contributed to a lot of people leaving the church. Okay, the same book again. In 1832, Joseph Smith famously became involved with a 16-year-old carpenter's daughter named Fanny Alger, who eventually moved into the Smith home in about 1835. So we're not exactly sure about these dates. George Smith here gives the age of Fanny at 16 years old, so a fairly young teenager. But depending on the dates given, it can go from age 16 to 19. Pictured above, we have an artist's rendition of Fanny. And an article on the very good website, mormonthink.com, Polygamy and Fanny Alger. Accessed on April 2020. Interesting to note here, it looks like they put up a billboard, probably in Utah there. Mormonthink.com, a closer look at Mormonism. But in that article, they say some historians record the date of the marriage as early as 1833, and they called it a marriage, but that's in quotes there, marriage, quote unquote. While others believe it was 1835, putting Fanny's age anywhere from 17 to 19. Like we said on the previous slide, some put it as early or as young as age 16. All right, Todd Compton, author of the seminal work on Mormon polygamy in Sacred Loneliness, which came out in 1997. It lists Fanny Alger as Joseph Smith's first plural wife. Now that's interesting. This is one of the most important books on polygamy to come out, and he lists Fanny Alger as a wife, a plural wife. He gives the marriage date as early as 1833, which would make Joseph Smith 27 years old and Fanny 16 years old. So that early date makes Fanny 16. I used to think this book was more seminal, I guess, than it actually is. Because in it, I've kind of found some apologetics by Compton, especially about Fanny Alger being a wife, a plural wife. And then I come to do a little research on Compton, and it turns out he is a practicing Mormon. So almost every time when a practicing or true believing Mormon writes a book, they come to it with little objectivity. Okay, so a source that I would trust more than Compton is Gary James Bergera. This was an article he wrote in Dialogue in 2005. He's pictured above. I do not believe that Fanny Alger, whom Todd Compton counted as Smith's first plural wife, satisfies the criteria to be considered a wife, quote unquote. Briefly, the sources for such a marriage are all retrospective and presented from a point of view favoring plural marriage, rather than, say, an extramarital liaison, which seems clearly to be Oliver Cowdery's interpretation of the relationship. Yes, Oliver Cowdery interpreted this relationship to be adultery or as Bergera says, an extramarital liaison. So I'm going to go with Bergera on this and not Compton. And I have several other very good historians that support Bergera's conclusions. All right, the same article and dialogue. Joseph Smith's doctrine of eternal marriage, or the plurality of wives, was not formulated until after 1839 to 1840. So that doctrine was way after, long after the relationship with Joseph and Fanny. And just the fact that Joseph Smith kept this relationship a secret, kept it a secret from Emma, kept it a secret from the church, that lends credence to the idea that it was probably adultery. Brian Hales states that Joseph Smith kept Emma in the dark about plural marriage until the spring of 1843. So even Brian Hales, he's pictured above here, says that Emma was kept in the dark. According to the revelation in section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, you are supposed to get the permission of the first wife. Okay, William McClellan in a letter to Joseph Smith III. Joseph Smith III was the son of Emma and Joseph Smith, who started the Reorganized Church and was its prophet. This letter was written in 1872. So it says, the former apostle William E. McClellan visited Emma Smith in 1847 and held a lengthy conversation with her. McClellan told her that he had heard that one night she missed Joseph and Fanny Alger. She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through a crack and saw the transaction. So what was that transaction? Exclamation, exclamation. It's kind of a euphemism. She told me this story was verily true. So that's a pretty interesting account. Emma actually telling William E. McClellan that she saw Joseph and Fanny in the barn. I guess you'd have to interpret that as having sex. All right, and then William McClellan had an interview with J.H. Beadle in the Salt Lake Tribune in 1875 about the same issue. It's just worded a little bit different. William McClellan informed me of the spot where the first well-authenticated case of polygamy took place, or adultery, in which Joseph Smith was sealed, quote unquote, to the hired girl, that's Fanny. The sealing took place in a barn on the hay mow and was witnessed by Mrs. Smith, that's Emma, through a crack in the door, exclamation. This case created some scandal at the time among the saints, that long afterward, when he visited Mrs. Emma Smith at Nauvoo, she then and there declared on her honor that it was a fact, and she saw it with her own eyes. Okay, we have some accounts here in John Krakauer's book, Under the Banner of Heaven, a popular book on Mormonism, 2004. He's talking about Fanny Alger, not pictured above. This is just a general girl from the time period. I don't think we have any real pictures of Fanny Alger available. But anyway, John Krakauer says, Joseph remained perpetually and hopelessly smitten by the comeliest female members of his flock, more than one. Among them was a nubile resident of Kirtland named Fanny Alger, who was introduced to Joseph in 1830 after her parents became some of the earliest converts to the church. All right, by the winter of 1833, when Fanny was 16, she had moved into the Smith household as a domestic servant and had grown very close to both the Smiths, particularly Emma. So from the same book, Under the Banner of Heaven. At the age of 38, Joseph Smith married 14-year-old Helen Mar Kimball, and this according to their own essay at the Church of Jesus Christ.org. 14-year-old Helen Mar Kimball, that was the same age as Elizabeth Smart, pictured above, I guess, when she got abducted. All right, so from the church's essays, this one is Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. It's at churchofjesuschrist.org. It says, fragmentary evidence suggests that Joseph Smith acted on the angel's first command by marrying a plural wife, which was Fanny Alger, in Kirtland, Ohio, in the mid-1830s. only fragmentary evidence. They don't want you to think we have too much information about this relationship. I'm going to say that we have enough information about it to know what happened. And that's why this video is going to be so long, because it's more than fragmentary. And then it's interesting how they talk about the angel who came and appeared before Joseph Smith with a drawn sword and commanded him to practice plural marriage. It seems kind of ridiculous that Joseph would have to be commanded to have a secret relationship with a girl that was as young as 16 years old that Emma Smith knew nothing about. That's a real good way for God to establish a revelation and a new teaching is to keep it secret. Okay, a couple statements by D. Michael Quinn in the Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power book. I usually agree with him. This time I do not. He says that Fanny Alger was the prophet's first secret plural wife from early 1833 to the mid-1836. Yes, I do agree with him that it was secret, and that is a problem. I do not agree with Quinn that it's a plural wife. Now, you have to remember Quinn is also a true believing, I don't know if you'd call him Mormon. He's a true believer in the Restoration. He's a true believer in Joseph Smith and in the Book of Mormon. So it might be kind of hard for him to accept that Joseph Smith committed adultery with Fanny Alger around 1833 to 1835. All right, so what is going to be the success rate of having a secret wife behind Emma's back? Joseph Smith knew that she was jealous. He knew that she was feisty. And so why God would command Joseph Smith to have his first plural wife behind her back, a young teenager living in their house, makes no sense, because the relationship was doomed. And we're going to see one of the reasons why here. This is from Todd Compton again in an article in the Journal of Mormon History. Fanny's marriage to Joseph in Kirtland established a pattern that was repeated in Nauvoo. Joseph secretly marries a teenage servant or family friend living in his home, but Emma forces the young woman from the house when she discovers the relationship. God would know that that's how Emma's going to react, forcing the young woman from the house because she's so pissed off and jealous. The relationship had very little chance of success. And I also found it interesting to note that Richard Bushman, in his book Rough Stone Rolling, barely mentions Emma Smith's name and her reaction to the relationship in his relatively lengthy discussion of the Fanny Alger affair. He doesn't talk about Emma very much. I think that is because that's a big problem. Emma realized and pretty much knew that it was an adulterous affair, as did Oliver Cowdery. And then Grant Palmer brings up a good point in his book, Restoring Christ, 2017. The marriage, quote unquote, to Fanny Alger did not have an officiator, a ceremony, or a witness. So it was it was not a regular marriage ceremony. No officiator, no witness, no nothing. And Terrell Gibbons is a little bit more honest than some LDS apologists about this issue. In his book Wrestling the Angel, 2015, he says around 1833, Joseph Smith entered into a relationship with his first alleged plural wife, Fanny Alger. Alleged. I like the way he puts that in there. And then he says, though there is no record of an actual ritual that has appeared, no records have been found, so also indicating that it wasn't a marriage. And also another really good Mormon historian, Richard Van Wagner, in his book, Mormon Polygamy, 1989, he also talks about the lack of evidence for the marriage, mentioning that there were no witnesses and no officiator, and also that Joseph Smith did not claim publicly the power to bind on earth and seal eternally in the heavens until April 3rd, 1836, perhaps 1 year after the Alger incident. So in order for it to be an eternal plural marriage, you got to have the power to bind on earth and seal eternally in the heavens, which was given by Elijah, I think, to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in the Kirtland Temple, and that didn't happen until after the Alger relationship. All right, and the non-Mormon John L. Brooke, in his excellent book, The Refiner's Fire, 1994, is just very direct here. He's got no skin in the game. You know, he's not a Mormon. He's just an independent historian. So in the summer of 1835, Joseph Smith had his first extramarital affair. So he just calls it as he sees it. He had his first extramarital affair, not a marriage, with a servant girl named Fanny Alger, who subsequently was taken to be the first of Smith's 40-odd plural wives. Subsequently, caught in the act, literally, Smith had a violent confrontation with Emma Hale Smith and Oliver Cowdery. Oliver was actually called in to help deal with Emma, who had had such a violent confrontation with Joseph Smith about this. She kind of flipped her lid. Whom from that date, this is Oliver Cowdery, from that date became progressively disillusioned with his old friend. They had the kind of a falling out. Oliver Cowdery said, where once they were one, now they were two. And Sandra Tanner also talks about this issue in an article in the Salt Lake City Messenger, Utah Lighthouse Ministry, also in Van Wagner's book, Mormon Polygamy. She says, while the LDS essay Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo lists Fanny as Joseph's first plural wife, there is no contemporary evidence that an actual marriage ceremony took place, and Smith had not yet claimed the restoration of the keys supposedly necessary for the sealings. Okay, the Mormon Discussion Podcast.org, Mormon Primer on Belief, short book that Bill Reel wrote. I guess it was Bill Reel, 2017. He is the owner of that podcast network. And he says, Joseph entered this relationship with Fanny Alger in 1833, over 2 years before the sealing keys were restored, and both Emma, his wife, and Oliver Cowdery considered this relationship an affair. And those are early contemporary accounts and sources, Emma and Oliver. Those are early sources telling us what happened with Fanny Alger. So I would say that's a little bit more than fragmentary evidence. Anyway, Joseph Smith didn't have the keys to do this type of a relationship anyway. So in the same Mormon essay, Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, they say that little is known about this marriage. That's what they want you to think. Not much is known. We can't figure out what happened. There's no good contemporary accounts. Bullcrap. There's enough known. But they say little is known about this marriage, and nothing is known about the conversations between Joseph and Emma regarding Alger. Well, we don't have to know about their conversations because we have other sources. Okay, another source here, Anthony Metcalf, 10 years before the mast, 1888. An interview with Martin Harris. It's chapter 13 of that book. In or about the year 1833, the servant girl of Joe Smith stated that the prophet had made improper proposals to her, which created quite a talk amongst the people. Joe Smith went to Martin Harris, who's pictured above, to counsel with him concerning the girl's talk. Harris, supposing that Joe was innocent, told him to take no notice of the girl, that she was full of the devil and wanted to destroy the prophet of God. But Joe Smith acknowledged that there was more truth than poetry. There was more truth than poetry in what the girl said. All right, so back to a long account here by Anne Eliza Webb Young, wife number 19, 1875. Mrs. Smith had an adopted daughter, a very pretty, pleasing young girl. It's Fanny Alger, about 17 years old. She was extremely fond of her. It was with shocked surprise that the people heard that Sister Emma had turned Fanny out of the house in the night. By degrees, it became whispered about that Joseph's love for his adopted daughter was by no means a paternal affection, and you can go to jail for that today if you're having sex with a girl under age 18. And his wife, discovering the fact, at once took measures to place the girl beyond his reach. Angered at finding the two persons whom most she loved playing such a treacherous part toward her, she by no means spared her reproaches. She got angry. And finally the storm became so furious that Joseph was obliged to send at midnight for Oliver Cowdery, his scribe, to come and endeavor to settle matters between them. So this might be how Oliver Cowdery had such a good knowledge of what happened. He might have been called out to calm down Emma. And so when Oliver talks about this, he talks about it with some authority that he knew it was adultery. Okay, so the prophet and his scribe were sorely perplexed what to do with the girl, since Emma refused decidedly to allow her to remain in the house. And God should have known all of this would happen before he told Joseph Smith to marry, quote unquote, Fanny Alger. Okay, so they were perplexed what to do with the girl, since Emma refused decidedly to allow her to remain in the house. But after some consultation, my mother offered to take her until she could be sent to her relatives. Although her parents were living, they considered it the highest honor to have their daughter adopted into the prophet's family, and her mother, Clarissa Alger, was always claimed that she was sealed to Joseph at that time. And here is the modern cover of Wife number 19, Anne Eliza Young's book. John Krakauer again. He, Joseph Smith, tried to keep the relationship secret, but Emma eventually discovered Joseph and Fanny's blazing offense, and by the fall of 1835 had thrown the girl out of the house. All right, let's go back to George D. Smith's book, Nauvoo Polygamy. George is pictured above here. He's one of the founders of Signature Books, publisher of some of the best Mormon history books out there. He says, Fanny Alger's relationship with Smith was attested to by several people, including Emma Smith, Warren Parrish, Oliver Cowdery, and Heber C. Kimball. Okay, Benjamin F. Johnson. He also wrote an account about this relationship. He's pictured above. An early acquaintance remembered the young Fanny Alger of Kirtland, Ohio, as a very nice and comely young woman. In other words, she was pretty. Toward whom everyone seemed partial for the amiability of her character. Everybody seemed partial, including Joseph Smith. All right, so we have some passages from Fawn Brodie's book, No Man Knows My History. She's pictured above. In 1835, it began to be whispered about that Joseph Smith had seduced a 17-year-old orphan girl whom Emma had taken into the family. And from the same book, this was the first woman other than Emma Hale whose name was linked with Joseph Smith. All right, Benjamin F. Johnson again, in a letter to George S. Gibbs, 1903. There lived then with his family, that's the prophet's family, a neighbor's daughter, Fanny Alger, who was about my own age. 17 years old was how old Benjamin was at the time. And it was whispered even then that Joseph Smith loved her, and there was some trouble with Oliver Cowdery. So there again, some indication that Oliver knew what was going on. Maybe he came and calmed down Emma. There was some trouble with Oliver Cowdery, and whisper said that it was relating to a girl then living in the prophet's family. Benjamin Johnson said that Alger was with Smith for 3 years, but that they broke up before the social disruption of 1837 to 1838. This is again from George D. Smith's book. The cover is pictured above. And then Benjamin F. Johnson, again, the letter to Gibbs. Without a doubt in my mind, Fanny Alger was at Kirtland, the prophet's first plural wife. So that was his opinion. All right, so again from Brodie's book, the prophet's grammar teacher, C.G. Webb, told one writer that this girl, that's Fanny, was unable to conceal the consequences of her celestial relation with the prophet, and that Emma drove her out of the house. Unable to conceal the consequences. Well, that is a pregnancy. This is debatable. We're not really sure what happened here, but maybe Joseph Smith got Fanny Alger pregnant. And a statement by Todd Compton, Journal of Mormon History, again. Since there is no record of Fanny's child, either it died young, it was raised under another name, or Webb was repeating a rumor without basis in fact. We got a birth certificate pictured above here. All right, so there is some DNA evidence in this article you can look at here, Journal of Mormon History. It says, there is insufficient historical evidence to show that Fanny had a child with Joseph Smith, or that she already had a child when she married Custer. Orison Smith, a possible son of Joseph and Fanny's, was ruled out through DNA evidence. Whether or not Fanny Alger bore Joseph a child, it is clear that the breath of the scandal was hot upon his neck. And something interesting that showed up in Joseph Smith's journal, October 17, 1835, he says, called my family together, arranged my domestic concerns, and dismissed my boarders. So maybe he dismissed Fanny Alger from his house. All right, so what was in the Mormon scriptures at this time regarding plural marriage or polygamy? Well, it's interesting if you go to the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, section 101. There was something in there that's not in there anymore. It says, inasmuch as this church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, all these rumors about Fanny Alger, reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in the case of death. So this was the official teaching to the public and the official teaching in the scripture of the church, that one man should have one wife, but Joseph Smith did not follow this. And it's interesting to note that this scripture was in the Doctrine and Covenants for a long time. It wasn't removed until 1876, way after Joseph Smith is dead, and almost to the point where Brigham Young is dead. That this scripture, that one man should have one wife, stayed in there for so long, but this whole time, the Mormon leaders were practicing polygamy. All right, so in 1876, they changed that passage. They took it out, and it got replaced with section 132, which was a revelation given to the prophet Joseph Smith at Nauvoo, Illinois, recorded in 1843, relating to the new and everlasting covenant, including the eternity of the marriage covenant and the principle of plural marriage. But section 132 didn't go into the Mormon scripture until 1876. That is a long time. And I'm reading here from the heading of the modern edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. And this is kind of an interesting point that's in the heading. It says, although the revelation was recorded in 1843, evidence indicates that some of the principles involved in this revelation were known by the prophet as early as 1831. Now, why did they have to put that in? Well, it's because of people like Fanny Alger. They want people to think that this revelation occurred way earlier than it actually did, way earlier than 1843. They're saying, well, you know, Joseph Smith talked about this revelation and mentioned it to a few people in secret as early as 1831. But this whole time in the Doctrine and Covenants in the scripture of the church, which the members read, it said something different, that you're only supposed to have one wife. So it's a contradiction. Okay, C.G. Webb told W. Weil in the 1880s that Joseph Smith was sealed in Kirtland secretly to Fanny Alger, and Emma was furious. This is in Brodie's book and W. Wiles' book, Mormon Portraits, 1886. And we have an account from Warren Parrish. This is again in Brodie's book. Warren Parrish, who for a time was Joseph's secretary, told young Benjamin Johnson that he and Oliver Cowdery knew the report of an illicit affair between the girl, it's Fanny Alger, an illicit affair between the girl and the prophet to be true, for they were spied upon and found together. And from the book Nauvoo Polygamy again, Warren Parrish said that Joseph had been found in the hay with his housekeeper. He said Joseph and Fanny were discovered together as wife. So that's kind of another euphemism. These were puritanical people. They didn't like to discuss sex, and they used these euphemistic terms for sex. But Joseph and Fanny were discovered together as wife. Okay, in September 1836, after Fanny had spent some time as a teenage servant in the home of Joseph and Emma Smith, the Algers left Kirtland, and pictured above is the home of Joseph and Emma in Kirtland. All right, and an account here by Historicus. That's a pseudonym. This was an article in the Anti-Polygamy Standard in 1881. Says Emma Smith, Joseph's wife, had a young girl in her employment by the name of Fanny Alger or Alger. In consequence of the free loveism of the prophet, Emma's recovery was very much retarded, and for several months she was in a very low condition. So Emma sounds like she got depressed because of this relationship. Emma discovered that Joseph had been celestializing with this maiden Fanny, who acknowledged the truth. Again, a euphemism because they're uncomfortable talking about sex. Joseph had been celestializing with this maiden Fanny, but Joseph denied it in toto and stigmatized the statement of the girl as a base fabrication. Emma, of course, believed the girl. Excuse me. Emma, of course, believed the girl, as she was very well aware that no confidence could be placed in her husband, and she became terribly worked up about it. She was like a mad woman, so she got very angry and acted so violently that Oliver Cowdery and some of the elders were called in to minister to her and cast the devil out of Sister Emma. So again, it's showing Oliver had firsthand information here, trying to calm down Emma. Whatever may have been Sister Emma's other faults, she certainly must have had a very forbearing and forgiving disposition. That's probably not the case. Probably she just had kids that needed to be taken care of and needed the support from her husband. For she condoned this offense as well as innumerable other similar ones. And here's the heading of the Anti-Polygamy Standard, a newspaper. And back to the Wikipedia article. In January 1838, some months after the Algers had left Kirtland, Oliver Cowdery, one of the three witnesses to the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, wrote to his brother concerning his indignation, his anger, at Smith's relationship with Alger. Okay, so Oliver Cowdery, he was an apostle. He was assistant president of the church at this time where the Fanny Alger affair was happening. Assistant president was actually higher than the first presidency, than the members of the first presidency. It was a very high calling in the early days of the church. It'd be hard to imagine a better witness to what happened, or a better quality of witness than Oliver Cowdery. He was there for the majority of the significant events in the church, the significant visions, etc. He was there with Joseph Smith for all these important events. And then he turned on Joseph Smith. But it's hard to imagine a more reliable witness than Oliver Cowdery. All right, so here's the famous statement by Oliver Cowdery. Cowdery said that he had discussed with Joseph Smith the dirty, nasty, filthy affair. You probably heard of that before. Of his, that's Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger, in which I strictly declared that I had never deserted from the truth in the matter, and as I suppose was admitted by himself. So he's saying Joseph Smith admitted that it was an affair, and he calls it a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. This is Oliver Cowdery in a letter to his brother Warren A. Cowdery, January 21st, 1838. Oliver may have originally used the word scrape. The word affair may have been written over the word scrape by Warren, his brother, in the letter book. So if you look at this this letter, that's written in the letter book. It's not the original. It's a copy written in the letter book. It says in the highlighted area, a dirty, nasty, filthy affair of his and Fanny Alger's was talked over. And what Brian Hales is saying is that there is a word written underneath the word affair, and he and Don Bradley are saying that they were able to determine that the word underneath it was scrape. I am not sure how they did that because it's very hard to make out what is written underneath there. It's simply the word affair, and it's really hard to know what was written right underneath it. But they're saying it's the word scrape. I don't know if that's true. That works in the favor of the church. Dirty, nasty, filthy scrape. Maybe Oliver was just talking about polygamy and not an affair, not adultery. That's kind of their case. But I don't know if they've really made their case. So here is the whole page of that letter that Oliver Cowdery wrote to his brother Warren Cowdery in 1838, where he talks about the relationship between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger as a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. This letter is really hard to read, and I looked all over online, and there was no transcription of it anywhere online. So then I thought, well, why is this not in the Joseph Smith Papers Project? So I went and looked over there. They have another letter on the same date, but they do not have this letter or this page, and there's no transcription of this page or this part of the letter on the Joseph Smith Papers Project website. Why is that? Are they trying to hide this page? Are they trying to hide what Oliver Cowdery said about Joseph Smith? This is a very important letter, and I can't believe it's not on the Joseph Smith Papers Project. So you'll remember from the last slide that Oliver Cowdery said that Joseph Smith confessed to him that he did have an affair with Alger. Richard L. Bushman talks about this in Rough Stone Rolling. He says, Joseph Smith never denied a relationship with Alger, but insisted it was not adulterous. He wanted it on record that he had never confessed to such a sin, but that's not what Oliver Cowdery said in a private letter to his brother. So. All right, so here's another source about what Oliver Cowdery was saying about the adultery. Again, it's an early source, April 1838. Just like that letter was a very early source, 1838, by Oliver Cowdery. This is Ebenezer Robinson as clerk for the High Council Minutes, April 12th, 1838. You can find this in the Joseph Smith Papers. Also in Donald Q. Cannon and Lyndon W. Cook, editors of the Far West Record, Minutes of the Church. It's a Deseret Book, 1983. And this is a very important account. I'm going to go through it slowly because it gives us so much evidence in this account. George W. Harris testifies that one evening last fall, Oliver Cowdery was at his house together with Joseph Smith Jr. and Apostle Thomas B. Marsh when a conversation took place between Joseph Smith Jr. and Oliver Cowdery, when he, Oliver, seemed to insinuate that Joseph Smith Jr. was guilty of adultery with Fanny Alger. So there you go, boom, right there. Oliver seemed to insinuate that Joseph Smith was guilty of adultery. This is an early source in private church minutes. But when the question was put if he, Joseph, had ever acknowledged to him that he was guilty of such a thing, when he answered no, the apostle David W. Patton testifies that he went to Oliver Cowdery to inquire of him if a certain story was true respecting Joseph Smith's committing adultery with a certain girl, Fanny Alger. When he, Oliver, turned on his heel and insinuated as though he was guilty. So there you go, boom. Early source, Oliver Cowdery, a good source, turned on his heel and insinuated as though he was guilty. He then went on and gave a history of some circumstances respecting the adultery scrape, stating that no doubt it was true. So maybe how he had to go over and counsel and console Emma Smith, who freaked out. So how did Oliver Cowdery know about all these circumstances? That's an interesting question, and I think it's been answered. Also said that Joseph told him that he had confessed to Emma. So Oliver Cowdery said that Joseph Smith confessed to Emma. Well, Emma kind of caught him red-handed, so he basically got caught. He didn't have to say anything. Thomas B. Marsh testifies that while in Kirtland last summer, David W. Patton asked Oliver Cowdery if he, Joseph Smith Jr., had confessed to his wife that he was guilty of adultery with a certain girl, Fanny Alger. When Oliver Cowdery cocked up his eye very knowingly, and hesitated to answer the question, saying that he did not know as he was bound to answer the question, yet he conveyed the idea that it was true. There you go. He's not being totally direct here, but we have enough evidence here to figure out what's going on. Last fall, after Oliver came to this place, he heard a conversation take place between Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery when Joseph Smith asked him if he had ever confessed to him that he was guilty of adultery, when after a considerable winking, so, whatever he's going to say next is not really true. After a considerable winking, etc., he said no. But he's letting on to these people in the High Council what really happened. Joseph then asked him if he ever told him that he confessed to anybody. When he answered no, Joseph Smith then gave a history respecting the girl business. So there's another euphemism. Joseph Smith gave the history of the girl business. And if you want to find this book, this is what it looks like, or at least part of the cover. Far West Record, Minutes of the Church, 1830 to 1844, by Cannon and Cook. And you can also find that account at the Joseph Smith Papers. Search for Zion High Council and Bishopric Minutes, Far West, Caldwell County, Missouri. I don't know why they don't just call it the Far West Minutes. They do this to confuse people, I think. April 12th, 1838. Just go to the Joseph Smith Papers and you can read it on there as well. On April 12th, 1838, in these minutes, Cowdery was charged with seeking to destroy the character of the President Joseph Smith Jr. by falsely insinuating that he was guilty of adultery, etc. Eventually, the court concluded that Cowdery had made false accusations and cut him off from the church. In other words, Cowdery got excommunicated because Joseph Smith told a different story. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery told two different stories. Of course, Joseph Smith never admitted to doing this to the High Council. Joseph Smith wasn't on trial. Oliver was. Joseph Smith had the power here, or more power than Cowdery. And so the council sided with Joseph Smith that Cowdery had made false accusations, but I believe that is doubtful. And here's another account of this same event, the same High Council, by Max H. Parkin, Conflict at Kirtland book, 1966, long time ago. Max Parkin is pictured above. The charge of adulterous relations with a certain girl was leveled against Smith by Cowdery in Missouri in 1837. This accusation became one of the complaints that the church had against Cowdery in his excommunication trial in Far West, April 12, 1838. In rationalizing Cowdery's accusation, the prophet testified that Oliver Cowdery had been his bosom friend, therefore he entrusted him with many things. So maybe he did confess to Oliver, and Oliver sounded like he was involved in the process of consoling Emma. So this is just another account of that. And here in that same article by Robert M. Bowman, Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger, IRR.org, 2014. Bowman is pictured above here. The Far West Council's denial of the adultery accusation was not based on any notion that the relationship in question was a plural marriage. That really didn't come up. They didn't talk about that in the High Council minutes, so that's interesting, and now that's what the church claims. Evidently, it simply accepted Joseph's claim that there was nothing to the accusation. All right, let's go to Jeremy Runnells' CES letter 2013. The sealing power, quote unquote, was not restored until April 3rd, 1836, when Elijah appeared to Joseph in the Kirtland Temple and conferred the sealing keys upon him. Joseph's marriage, quote unquote, to Fanny Alger in 1833 was illegal under both the laws of the land and under any theory of divine authority because the keys had not been conferred yet. So it was illegal under the laws of the land. It was illegal under divine authority. So Runnells says that it was adultery. And in this picture, it's kind of funny. He says, "What do you mean it's against the law? I must have Fanny Alger. Make it work, Hiram. Make it work." So who do you think the church is going to trust in this situation? Are they going to trust Emma Smith and Oliver Cowdery? No, they trust Joseph Smith. They figure he was not lying. This comes from a manual, Latter-day Saint History, 1815 to 1846. Teacher Manual, Lesson 15, 2018. This is like one of the only places that you will find Fanny Alger mentioned in a manual. They do not like to talk about it, and it is very rarely mentioned in any manual. But I did find this one, and it said, at some point, Oliver Cowdery began to make false accusations regarding the prophet Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger. So, of course, they're going to side with Joseph. Oliver got excommunicated, so we can't trust him anymore, and it was just simply a false accusation of Oliver. They don't mention Emma, though. All right, go back to Bushman here. After the Far West Council excommunicated Cowdery, Alger disappears from the Mormon historical record for a quarter of a century. What is that, 25 years? This was a major scandal that the church wanted to forget about. All right, so this is some data that I gathered myself. From 1880 to 2020, Fanny Alger was mentioned 0 times in General Conference. That is a long time. 1880 to 2020, never mentioned this wife, supposed wife. From 1971 to 2020, she is mentioned 0 times in the Ensign Church magazine, pictured above. That is also a very long time. 1971 to 2020, never mentioned. They do not want members of the church finding out about Fanny. She is never mentioned in Mormon scripture, and she is rarely mentioned in church manuals, as I've already said. All this information can be verified at churchofjesuschrist.org, or at least most of it. All right, a statement by Jim Whitefield, pictured above, The Mormon Delusion, The Truth Behind Polygamy and Secret Polyandry, 2012. It's like a 5-volume set that he put together. It's pretty good. Joseph Smith later covered his adultery by inventing the concept of a restoration of polygamy. This new dimension allowed him to continue to have his way with the young and comely Fanny Alger whenever he pleased. All right, from the same source, here you can see the cover of the book. In terms of the lies and cover-up following the Fanny Alger affair, things went from bad to worse for both Smith and his fledgling church. Rumors circulated and apostasy became rife in the face of them. All right, we have John J. Hammond here. He's pictured above. Believe it or not, he has written a 10-volume set on the early days of the church. This one is volume 4, An Inaccessible Mormon Zion, 2012. He says, the 1835 Fanny Alger affair had an eventual serious disruptive influence in high Mormon church circles. In fact, over the last 9 or 10 years of his life, Joseph Smith Jr.'s sexual behavior and his polygamous doctrines were an unmitigated disaster for the church and for himself, the direct cause of the alienation and apostasy and or purging of many high-ranking Mormon leaders. Oliver Cowdery, of course, William Law, and others. The Fanny Alger affair drove a serious wedge between Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith. All right, another statement here by Whitefield. Evidence of Smith's illicit liaison with Fanny Alger leads church historians to accept by assumption alone that a marriage existed. They are forced to accept evidence that a sexual relationship took place, but they cannot possibly admit that Smith had an adulterous affair. That would be terrible for the church. He therefore must have married Fanny, despite there being absolutely no evidence to support such a claim. That's not entirely true. There is some evidence, but I think it is fairly weak. And here you can see the 5-volume set of the Mormon Delusion, and then he wrote another book, The Bible Delusion, Hang On a Minute Moments and God's Mysterious Ways. Okay, so let's go to the Elder's Journal. In July of 1838, Joseph Smith included several statements designed to rebut rumors of adultery. To the question, do the Mormons believe in having more wives than one? He responded emphatically, no, not at this time, or not at the same time. All right, a good passage here in Van Wagner's book, Mormon Polygamy. Also compare History of the Church, Volume 3, page 230. In mid-December 1838, while incarcerated in Liberty, Missouri, see the picture above for the jail, Joseph Smith wrote a letter to the church, which reflected his personal difficulties. Perhaps alluding to the Alger rumors, he asked, was it for committing adultery that we were assailed? He then denied the charge as the false slander of renegade Mormon dissenters. Yeah, like Emma Hale Smith, his wife, not a renegade Mormon dissenter, and Oliver Cowdery, definitely not a renegade Mormon dissenter at the time, one of the most important members of the church and one of the most knowledgeable. But Joseph Smith wanted to say that these are renegade Mormon dissenters running through the world and spreading various foul and libelous reports against us. He dismissed the persistent allegation that the Mormons had not only dedicated our property, but our families also to the Lord, and Satan taking advantage of this, has perverted it into licentiousness, such as a community of wives, which is an abomination in the sight of God. So here we go, and he's talking to the church, when he's talking to the public, he denies any of this polygamy stuff happening. We only have one wife. We do not have a community of wives. Having a community of wives is an abomination in the sight of God, and actually that's what it says in the Book of Mormon. All right, so here is another important account from Fanny Brewer. It's an affidavit given in Boston, September 13, 1842, so it's fairly early on, 1842. Can be found in John C. Bennett's book, The History of the Saints. See Bennett's picture above. In the spring of 1837, I left Boston for Kirtland. There was much excitement against the prophet Joseph Smith on another account, an unlawful intercourse between himself and a young orphan girl residing in his family, Fanny Alger. And again, a euphemism, unlawful intercourse. With Fanny Alger, who was under his protection. Mr. Martin Harris told me that the prophet was most notorious for lying and licentiousness. And here's another source backing up Fanny Brewer. This is E.L. Kelly and Clark Braden. Public discussions of the issues between the reorganized church and the regular LDS church. 1884. Fanny Brewer testifies that Smith had serious trouble in Kirtland, arising from his seducing an orphan girl living in his family, and that Martin Harris told her that Smith was notoriously lewd and untruthful. All right, from the Kelly and Braden source, Lewis Bond and Ezra Bond have repeatedly stated that their father and mother, who were amongst the first Mormons in Kirtland, repeatedly declared that Smith practiced polygamy in Kirtland and that he followed a girl into a privy and committed fornication with her, which was Fanny Alger. So, not a polygamous plural marriage, but he committed fornication. And here's another source, 1885, Alfred Holbrook, Reminiscence of the Happy Life of a Teacher. Don Bradley found all these sources, so there's probably more out there too for people to find. The doctrine of polygamy was first broached in Kirtland, Ohio by the revelation of Joe Smith with reference to the daughter Fanny Alger of one of the old inhabitants of Kirtland who was sealed to Joe as a spiritual wife. And here's a statement from Bushman. All of these second-hand witnesses, Mormon and non-Mormon, agreed that Smith had married Alger as a plural wife. That's not entirely true, as we've seen some sources, these late sources that say it was fornication and adultery. All right, so in Sacred Loneliness again, Todd Compton, he discusses the late 19th century evidence and its differing reliability, concluding that Smith's relationship with Alger, though fleeting, was more than a casual sexual affair, and that she was one of Joseph Smith's earliest plural wives. And remember, Todd Compton is an active member of the church. He's a true believer, and this is the position of the church. He's probably just trying to help the church. But George D. Smith clarified Compton's position in his book, Nauvoo Polygamy, and also in Todd Compton to the editor of the Journal of Mormon History. Compton had to admit the following. Compton later clarified his deduction by admitting that the evidence for a marriage or a sealing implied hard-to-verify assumptions and uncertainties, and agreed that the late second-hand reminiscence may not be the best evidence. So I'm not sure why he decided to go ahead in his book and say that, yeah, it was a plural wife, but he did. All right, another statement by George D. Smith. He's talking about Joseph Bates Noble in his autobiography. Noble is pictured above. I, George D. Smith, hesitate to concur with Compton's interpretation of their relationship as a marriage. In my view, Joseph Noble was correct when he said that he had performed the first patriarchal marriage in this dispensation by sealing Louisa Beeman to Joseph Smith in April of 1841. That was after the Alger affair. So, and we're going to have several other prominent Mormon historians, not Mormon, but prominent historians, that say that the first plural marriage to Joseph Smith was Louisa Beeman. It was not Fanny Alger. All right, so here's Kathleen Melanakos in Secret Combinations book. I quote a lot from this book. It's a very good book. Though Smith had already had several affairs, that's what she calls them, for instance, with Fanny Alger and Lucinda Morgan Harris in the spring of 1841, he began his spree of marrying over 42 women. That number kind of goes up and down depending on which historian you listen to, but it's at least like 30, 35. He started his spree of marrying over 42 women, starting with Louisa Beeman. So there you have that name again. The first one was Louisa Beeman. The historian Grant Palmer says the same thing. He went on the Ancient Paths video show with Pastor Jason Wallace. You can watch this on YouTube. Grant Palmer on New Polygamy Statement. So Palmer says, I think that Joseph Smith begins polygamy with Louisa Beeman in 1841. So there's more verification of that. The church is now saying in their essay that he started as early as 1833, 34, or 35 with Fanny Alger, but there is a lack of documentation. And perhaps most important, the sealing power was not revealed to Joseph Smith by the church's own admission until April 3rd, 1836 in the Kirtland Temple. So he doesn't have the sealing powers, but there's no ceremony. And he also said, there's no witnesses, no officiator. Joseph Smith basically would have had to marry them himself, which is weird. He also says polygamy is illegal in the state of Ohio. It's illegal in Missouri. It's illegal in Illinois. And yet he is doing all these things. And here is a picture of Grant Palmer. Rest in peace. And again, from Grant Palmer on the Ancient Pass video. In regards to Fanny and Joseph, I just don't think there's any evidence that it was a marriage. There's no test of a revelation permitting polygamous marriage. Joseph Smith may have talked about polygamy in Kirtland, but there's no evidence that he practiced it until April 5th, 1841 in Nauvoo, when he married Louisa Beeman. And the historian Lawrence Foster basically says the same thing here. I got this out of Wikipedia. Foster is pictured above. Lawrence Foster disputes Compton's assumption, arguing that although contemporary evidence strongly suggests that Smith and Alger engaged in sexual relations, the evidence does not indicate that the relationship was viewed either by Smith himself or by his associates at the time as a marriage. It was not viewed as a marriage by Smith. It was not viewed by his associates as a marriage. All right, Lawrence Foster again. Review of Todd Compton in Sacred Loneliness. Dialogue, A Journal of Mormon Thought, 2001. Lawrence Foster noted that before Smith's first documented plural marriage to Louisa Beeman in April 1841, so there you have it again, Smith's earlier sexual relationships may have been considered marriages, but we lack convincing contemporary evidence supporting such an interpretation. All right, so Linda King Newell, pictured above. She's one of the authors of Mormon Enigma, the book about Emma. This is a book review of Richard Van Wagner's Mormon Polygamy. And she says that in the book, it implies that earlier documented relationships before Louisa Beeman, in other words, were extramarital affairs rather than polygamous. The book argues that plural marriage actually began in Nauvoo. So that's Richard Van Wagner. He implied that the relationship with Alger was an extramarital affair. And we have George D. Smith again in Dialogue, 1994. Evidence from Joseph Smith and his secretary William Clayton suggests that the prophet claimed to receive a separate injunction to practice polygamy in 1843 and not earlier. So that's way after Alger. That's 1843 where he got the injunction to practice polygamy. All right, we get the opinion from MormonThink.com, Polygamy Fanny Alger article accessed in 2020. And this is basically my opinion as well. Critics of the church believe that Joseph had an affair with Fanny, was found out, and then introduced the concept of plural marriage in order to justify and continue his affair with her, Alger, and then with other women. All right, another statement from MormonThink.com, basically reaffirming things that we've already gone over. Regardless of whether Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger was merely a sexual encounter or a marriage, quote unquote, it was adulterous. Joseph could only be legally married to one person, and even if it is claimed that the marriage was a symbolic, celestial only sealing, the sealing power was not restored until April 1836, after Joseph's marriage, quote unquote, to Fanny. So it couldn't have been a celestial only sealing because the power was not in the church yet. All right, Richard Van Wagner again. He's pictured above as a younger man. Of course, his book is Mormon Polygamy. Confusion over the exact nature and extent of Joseph Smith's involvement with Fanny Alger has remained to this day. That there was a sexual relationship seems probable, and yeah, we don't know for sure. what happened with Alger. Maybe he did a quick little ceremony and boom, he married her there by himself. In my mind, he's not really a prophet of God anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I don't believe he can receive revelation. Even if it was polygamy, I still don't think that that's a legitimate marriage. So that's where I stand. And a statement again from D. Michael Quinn. I'm going to have to disagree with him on this one. Usually I agree, and usually his work is top-notch. But, this is a matter of opinions. People can have different opinions on this. Historian D. Michael Quinn came to the conclusion that Joseph Smith must have been married to Fanny Alger, probably from about 1833. All right, another letter from the former apostle William E. McClellin to Joseph Smith III. That's Joseph Smith's son in 1872. One of the apostles, William E. McClellin, assumed that this must have been the origin of celestial marriage because it was the first well-authenticated case of polygamy. That was his assumption. Okay, Eliza J. Webb, pictured above, not a very good picture. The mother of Anne Eliza Webb Young, who we have talked about. A letter to Mary Bond in 1876. Fanny Alger's mother says that Fanny was sealed to Joseph by Oliver Cowdery in Kirtland in 1835 or 1836. I only know that Emma Smith turned Fanny out of her house because of Joseph's intimacy with her. This is an interesting comment. Fanny Alger had lived in Joseph's family several years, and when she left there, she came and lived with me for a few weeks after Emma threw her out. I suppose your mother will remember what a talk the whole affair made, which must lead her to suspect that Joseph the prophet was not infallible, and in fact, he committed adultery. All right, Eliza J. Webb again, same letter to Mary Bond. I do not know that the sealing commenced, quote unquote, in Kirtland, but I am perfectly satisfied that something similar commenced. Joseph Smith marrying himself. And my judgment is principally formed from what Fanny Alger told me herself concerning her reasons for leaving Sister Emma. Okay, here's kind of a weird source. It's one that the Mormon apologists like to use. It's from Levi Ward Hancock's autobiography, with additions in 1896 by his son, Mosiah Hancock. He just hand-wrote into his autobiography this account, I guess after Levi was dead. So maybe it's just something that Mosiah had heard passed down from his father. Anyway, let's read through this. Father Levi goes to the father Samuel Alger, his father's brother-in-law, and said, Samuel, the prophet Joseph loves your daughter Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you? Uncle Sam says, go and talk to the old woman about it. 'Twill be as she says. Father goes to his sister and said, Clarisse, Brother Joseph, the prophet of the Most High God, loves Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you? And said she, go and talk to Fanny. It will be all right with me. Father goes to Fanny and said, Fanny, Brother Joseph, the prophet, loves you and wishes you for a wife. Will you be his wife? I will, Levi, said she. Father takes Fanny to Joseph and said, Brother Joseph, I have been successful in my mission. Father gave her to Joseph, repeating the ceremony as Joseph repeated it to him. So apparently, according to this account, Joseph repeated the ceremony to this Levi Hancock. Levi Hancock remembered it, told his son, Mosiah Hancock, who then in 1896 wrote this into his autobiography by hand. Not sure if that's really how it went down. Maybe that's just what the family thought happened, and they told Mosiah this, and Mosiah just wrote down what he thought happened. It's kind of hard to say. And this is what H. Michael Marquardt had to say about that account. This is in The Rise of Mormonism, 2013. Michael is pictured above here. It says, Mosiah Hancock's information may have been obtained through family tradition, but there are historical problems with the text that does not make it a reliable source as far as this marriage is concerned. All right, we now have a statement by Larry Munger, An Effort of Inquiry, 2016. He also mentions Levi Hancock. He says, there is no legal paper record that Joseph Smith ever married Fanny Alger. We are not told where Levi Hancock ever received the authority to perform marriages, and we know that Joseph Smith didn't perform his first marriage ceremony until November of 1835, and some would say it was after that. So there remain serious questions about the validity of such a marriage. Until 1835, Seymour Brunson was the only one licensed to perform marriages in the church. So, and Seymour Brunson didn't do the marriage for Fanny Alger, so. And Robert M. Bowman also talks about this Mosiah Hancock account. He says that it is secondhand and it is dubious on its own merits. And it's a very late account, too, 1896. What is that, like 70 years after the fact or so? And even Brian Hales, who likes to use this account, and so does Todd Compton, but even Brian Hales called it a dubious account. And then Munger asks a couple other questions here. If God told Joseph Smith to enter into a plural marriage with Fanny Alger, why didn't Joseph Smith stand up for Fanny and defend her as a husband would be expected to do for his wife or wives? He really didn't stand up for her. He didn't defend her. He didn't say to Emma, this is my wife and she has to be a part of our family. He just caved in to Emma and just allowed Emma to throw her out. And from that time on, Fanny was really never Joseph Smith's wife. And then John Hammond basically says the same thing in his book. Fanny had been forced to leave Kirtland for Indiana in 1836, forced because Emma basically threw her out. And Joseph made no attempt to take responsibility for her and defend the relationship as a divinely sanctioned polygamous one. Joseph made no attempt to take responsibility for her, didn't defend the relationship, just kind of let her go. And then back to the Fawn Brodie book, No Man Knows My History, talking about Emma here. Emma is pictured above. The Fanny Alger affair was insufferable to Emma, who was jealous of her husband. Emma must have been humiliated for the church itself. And poor Emma, in Nauvoo, Emma came very close to divorcing her husband when his womanizing behavior became totally obsessive and absolutely out of control. So that's too bad for Emma. I hadn't heard that she wanted to divorce her husband at one time. That would also make a good video. I have heard that Emma may have tried to poison Joseph Smith, and there was like 10 other poisonings. That would also make a good video to investigate that and see if that's true. All right, I'm back to Larry Munger's book. He's asking some more questions. Why didn't Emma believe Joseph when he told her that God had revealed the doctrine of plural wives to him? That's a good question. Why didn't Emma believe in this after Joseph is saying, hey, man, I got a revelation? Certainly she knew him better than anybody else at that time, having lived with him as his wife. Yes, she must have known him probably better than anybody, but she does not accept the revelation about plural marriage. And I believe when the revelation came for Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, Joseph gave it to Emma, and she threw it into the fire. But I guess Joseph Smith had another copy. Maybe he knew that Emma might do something like that. And then Munger says, why did Emma cower Joseph so much? Why did Emma cower Joseph so much? Why was he so afraid of her? And then back to Robert Bowman here at IRR.org. It is clear that Emma did not consider the relationship between Joseph and Fanny a marriage. And according to Section 132, they are supposed to get the first wife's permission. Joseph did not do that. But Emma never really considered this to be a marriage, so that's evidence that it was not a marriage. And back to Grant Palmer's book, Restoring Christ. Joseph Smith may have talked about polygamy in Kirtland, but there is no cogent evidence that he practiced it until 1841. So yeah, maybe he mentioned it to a few people and talked about it, but there is no evidence that he practiced it until 1841. And Palmer continues, yet several Mormon scholars have claimed that Fanny Alger was Joseph Smith's first polygamous wife. For example, Todd, Compton, and Brian Hales. I think he lists those. However, to make the case, they need to persuasively explain several problems, and he'll tell us what those are. And Palmer continues, the biggest question seems to be when this supposed sealing, concubinage, or affair took place, when it took place. Benjamin F. Johnson, many decades later, dated it to 1835. Eliza R. Snow places it about the time that she went to live with the Smiths in the spring of 1836. Todd, Compton, and Brian Hales promote an even earlier date. Most historians are comfortable dating it to the 1835-1836. Here's why the date matters. As understood by the LDS Church, Smith received the sealing keys necessary to perform plural marriage in the Kirtland Temple on April 3rd, 1836. So kind of on the far end of that date range. If Smith's supposed marriage to Alger occurred before this date, which is most likely, then it is not a sealing as understood within Mormon theology. If it occurs before the claimed bestowal of keys by Elijah, then any assertions that Fanny Alger was a plural wife are anachronistic. Or in other words, if the marriage occurred before April 3rd, 1836, which it probably did, it's a major death knell for apologetic arguments that she was his first plural wife. And as we've gone through in this video, the first plural wife was probably Louisa Beeman. All right, another statement here from the Mormon Essay at the church's website. Several Latter-day Saints who lived in Kirtland reported decades later that Joseph Smith had married Alger, who lived and worked in the Smith household after he had obtained her consent and that of her parents. That's up for debate. There's that only that Levi Hancock account where they got the consent of the parents. Fanny probably did give her consent, or she wouldn't have done it. But there's more accounts than that. And the church doesn't like to look at the accounts of Emma as a contemporary. They don't like to look at the accounts of Oliver Cowdery, which was contemporary to the event. Also, there was Fanny Brewer that was not too long after the event. So there are some good accounts that are earlier, not just these reported decades later. And then this picture, it says, okay, Joseph, in this scene, you and Emma gaze a moment at the setting sun. You give Emma a chaste kiss on the cheek. Then you hurry away to boink Fanny. And action. Yeah, that's really how the church makes their movies, right? And back to Fawn Brodie. I think this is how it went down. So let's read this. When in later years polygamy had become an accepted pattern in Mormon life, Joseph's leading elders looked back to the Kirtland days and concluded that Fanny Alger had been the prophet's first plural wife. Yeah, because that was the accepted pattern later on in the church's history, so they probably just applied that. They just probably backdated that to say, oh yeah, that's probably what happened to Alger. But she was the first one that got in trouble with Joseph Smith, or one of the first ones. So maybe Joseph Smith just got caught committing adultery, and he didn't have the idea of calling it polygamy at the time. And the church admits in their essay that the marriage with Alger ended in separation. It was a very short marriage, quote unquote. And here from the church history topics on their website, Fanny Alger, this is a different account than the essay. The marriage between Joseph and Fanny was evidently of a short duration, and then I put in there, maybe 1 or 2 years. Fanny married Solomon in 1836, so that is really quick after the relationship with Joseph Smith. Fanny married Solomon. Now, why did she do that? Was she pregnant? Wanted to hide the fact that she was pregnant? I don't know. I don't know why she did it so quick, but it doesn't bode well for it being a celestial sealing. And Grant Palmer points this out in his book, Restoring Christ. He says, shortly after the concubinage or affair became publicly known, so that's pretty interesting. He calls it a concubine or an affair. So according to Grant Palmer and his research, Joseph Smith did have concubines as well. Women that he didn't marry. They're basically just to have sex with for one night or a short period of time. Anyway, after the affair, Alger left the state and quickly married a non-Mormon, as we talked about, something one would not expect from a plural wife. Yes, you would not expect that. All right, a statement by Bushman again in Rough Stone Rolling. After the relationship with Fanny didn't work out, Joseph waited another 5 years to involve himself in polygamy. That's pretty interesting. If he was commanded to start practicing polygamy that early on, in 1831, why did he wait 5 years more to involve himself in polygamy again? It's more like he got busted by Emma, got busted by Oliver Cowdery, tried to cover it up, tried to lie about it, tried to hide it, tried to be a good boy for 5 years, but, Joseph Smith, he was just too horny, he couldn't do it. And so then later on, he marries like 35 more women. But it's interesting that he waited for 5 years. The delay showed an uncharacteristic reluctance, hard for one who feared God. And back to the church history topics on Fanny Alger. This is different again than the essay. It's their church topics. Very little is known about the marriage between Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger. Ha! Well, how did I make an 1.5 hour long video then? Very little is known about the marriage between Smith and Alger. That is not true. There's quite a bit to know, and it's all in this video. Local antagonists circulated many rumors attacking Joseph, including allegations that he committed adultery. Yeah, and one of those people was his wife. You can't really say that that's just a local antagonist. That was his wife. Some of the rumors were said to originate with Oliver Cowdery. So notice how they put that, how they phrase that. Some of the rumors were said, just gossip, were said to originate with Oliver Cowdery. No. We have the High Council minutes where Oliver Cowdery just directly basically says, yeah, Joseph Smith committed adultery. We have that in the High Council minutes in Far West. And we have his letter to his brother saying it was a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. So it's more than it's just, were said by some antagonist and some rumor. It's a lot more evidence than that. And Andrew Jensen, church historian, pictured above, listed Fanny Alger as one of the first of Joseph's wives. It's not surprising. The Apostle John A. Widstow said the same thing in Joseph Smith's Seeker After Truth, 1951. It seems that Fanny Alger was one of Joseph Smith's first plural wives. This is a rare statement. These guys very rarely mention this in books, and I've searched through quite a few books. John A. Widstow mentions it, but there's hardly anybody else that mentions it like you'd think. You would think Joseph Fielding Smith would talk about it. You would think that Bruce R. McConkie would talk about it. They don't. Okay, an account from Eliza R. Snow in the Andrew Jensen papers. Eliza says, Emma made such a fuss about Fanny Alger. Sister Eliza R. Snow was well acquainted with her as she lived with the prophet at the time. And you can see the picture above, smoke blowing out her ears. That's basically how Emma reacted. And Fanny Alger wanted to keep it a secret. I think this was pretty common in Mormon polygamy. The women really didn't like to talk about it. This is from Bushman, again in Rough Stone Rolling. You can also find the original account. But it says, after Smith's death, when Alger's brother asked her about her relationship with Joseph Smith, this is what Fanny Alger said. That is all a matter of my own, and I have nothing to communicate. Well, it would have been nice if she did say something, because we really could have pinned down Joseph Smith even better. Joseph Smith asked Fanny's uncle, Levi Hancock, to conduct her to Missouri, which I guess is where Joseph Smith was, but she accompanied her parents instead, so Fanny did not go with Joseph Smith, like you would expect an eternal wife would do. Okay, from a clerk record photocopy in the possession of Brian Hales, archived from the original in 2017. The Algers stopped in Dublin, Wayne County, Indiana, and there Fanny met, and on November 16, 1836, married Solomon Custer, a non-Mormon, listed in various censuses as a grocer, a baker, and a merchant. Although her parents continued on their way to Nauvoo, Illinois, and eventually to the Utah Territory, the Custers, which was Fanny and Solomon, remained in Indiana. It's kind of interesting. Joseph Smith never saw Fanny Alger again. Fanny bore 9 children, only 2 of whom survived her. That's just how it kind of was in those days. Pretty sad. In 1874, Fanny joined the Universalist Church in Dublin, Indiana, so she didn't stay active in the Mormon Church. Fanny's funeral was held in the Dublin, Indiana church after she died at the home of her son in Indianapolis, Indiana on November 29, 1889. She was 72 years old, so she lived to a pretty good age for back in then. And since the church thinks that it was Joseph Smith's first plural wife, Fanny Alger was sealed to the deceased prophet Joseph Smith by proxy in the Salt Lake Temple in 1899. I think the prophet Lorenzo Snow had that done. Fanny's obituary reported that in Indiana, she was generally beloved by all who knew her and was noted for her benevolence of spirit and generous heartedness. Kind of nice to know something about her because the church has reported so little about Joseph Smith's plural wives. Okay, and I think Grant Palmer wraps it up pretty good here. The sexual history of Joseph Smith is rather extraordinary. Take the extensive sexual allegations made against him from 1827 to 1844, and it was from 14 different women, sexual allegations. The fact that the accusations came from persons in 4 and possibly 5 different states during a 16-year period is both unusual and troubling. Imagine if a Mormon bishop or a Mormon stake president had that kind of a track record. They would be removed from their position. Smith's secretive behavior was always hidden from his wife, Emma, and I think that's really one of the most troubling parts about this. Unless she discovered him like she did with Fanny in the barn. Perhaps Emma's cousins Levi and Hyle Lewis were accurate when they expressed in 1834 that to Joseph Smith adultery was no crime. His denials and clandestine demeanor have all the earmarks of adultery. Yes, his denials and clandestine demeanor, trying to keep it a secret, have all the earmarks of adultery. I totally agree with Palmer on this. And here we have a secretive, clandestine man with no face. That's kind of what Joseph Smith tried to do. All right, we have one more slide. A statement here by Joseph Smith shortly before his death in 1844. It's in the history of the church. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery. Yep, by Emma and by Oliver Cowdery, Warren Parrish, Fanny Brewer, others, William McClellin, and having 7 wives when I can only find 1. All the way up to 1844, he says, yeah, I still just have 1 wife. No, he didn't. I am the same man, and I am as innocent as I was 14 years ago, which he was not innocent, and I can prove them all perjurers. No, he cannot. There's enough evidence that it survived, I think, in this video that we can show that they were not all perjurers. And then the next statement here on the poster is from the Plural Marriage Essay by the Church. They're finally admitting it now. The fact about Joseph Smith, careful estimates put the number of Joseph Smith's wives between 30 and 40. That is admitted to by the church. So they are going against what the prophet Joseph Smith said about himself. And then the saints, went out to Utah, and finally, about 1853, Brigham Young finally taught polygamy publicly and out in the open. But it took a long time for that to happen. And then, of course, it wasn't too long after that polygamy was shut down. So that is going to do it for this video. And I thank you for watching the Joseph Smith's Polygamy, the Fanny Alger Affair video.